had denials of these kinds of documents. Do you think it's time for, I guess, all commissioners and ombudsmen to be allowed a little bit more access to these kinds of documents?
Well, that's a matter for Parliament. I mean, they are entitled to deny me access. I need to make that really clear. Obviously, I'd like to have the information, and people in my position always find it frustrating when we don't have access to the information we'd like to receive. Privileges is a complicated area, and it does depend on what particular powers I'm exercising in the course of my investigations. But I think, like anybody in my position, it is always better to have more information than less.
What were the provisions that allowed them to hand up the documents to the inquiry but not to you?
It was voluntary. They chose to hand them to the inquiry. They could have waived the privilege to me, but they chose not to.
Is there a particular story that stood out to you as being, I guess, particularly troubling in this whole situation, and perhaps an illustration of somebody's human rights being breached?
Many of these people came from war-torn and deeply troubled backgrounds. There are many refugees living in those towers, people who came from war-torn states where they had been tortured at the hands of their states. You know, the sight of police surrounding the buildings, government officials knocking at the door, unexpected, was deeply traumatising, I think, for some of the people we spoke to.
And what did people at Alfred Street make of the temporary fencing when they were finally let out for a fresh air break?
Degrading, inhumane, and that's one of the findings I make in this report. They acknowledged the mistake very quickly, I have to say, and they pulled it down very quickly. But it was appalling. I mean, it was an appalling look, and those who went out there expressed the view that led very clearly to a finding that it was degrading.
There's some common ground in your report and others that have reported recently, particularly the need for a surge capacity in caring, if you like, during times of crisis. But there's also some common ground in observations on how the public service is working. The fact that decision-making seems to be fairly opaque. Would you like to comment more generally on that?
We looked at the decision-making very carefully in this, and I think we were able to determine it as far as we were able to on the information available to us. I don't make broader observations around decision-making in the public sector. I think the evidence in this case speaks for itself. There was a control agency in charge. It was the Department of Health and Human Services. But clearly mistakes were made. And those mistakes, I have to say, have to a large extent been acknowledged.
The DHHS has been described elsewhere, the AMA, or former president of the AMA, as defensive. And I have to say their response in the report here also fits that description in my view. Do you have any comment on that?
I think I'll let the evidence speak for itself in that case.
One of the recommendations is to allow a person subject to detention to seek a review of the decision. How would that help someone?
There is already a requirement in the Act that detention must be reviewed. It is actually already, it is present. There are very few legislative controls in place on arbitrary detention. And bear in mind that what we're talking about here is people being deprived of liberty. The main control against arbitrary detention is a requirement that detention be reviewed. And it didn't, in fact, happen in this case.
Considering that you've made the decision yourself that this is contrary to law, does this kind of pave the way for people within the towers to claim compensation or take some kind of legal action against the government?
I'm not a court, and I have to be very clear about that. This is my opinion. I can express an opinion. The government does not agree with my opinion. What was very important for me, the purpose of this, was to shine a light on what was a very dark episode in our recent history. What happens next, I think, is a matter for others.
If the government had waited until the next day to impose the lockdown, do you think there would have been a need for an investigation?
Well, bearing in mind that the fundamental aspect of it that led to the finding is its immediacy. I think that probably answers your question. There would have been time to prepare, at least to some degree, to mitigate the effects. And I think if that had happened, we simply wouldn't have had the complaints we saw. I don't think we would have seen the scenes we saw.
That is where we leave the Victorian Ombudsman after she found the lockdown of Victoria's public housing towers breached human rights.